As we're just reaching 1 minute past 7:30, I would like to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor David Norman. He's curator of the Sedgwick Museum of Geology in Cambridge, also an Adele Fellow in Natural Sciences at Christ Church College in Cambridge. And he's going to talk to us this evening about Charles Darwin, a true natural philosopher and geologist, which is to say the emphasis, I gather, is going to be on his ability as a scientist, not so much focusing on his fame as a writer of a very famous book. So with that, I'd like to hand over to you, David, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Good evening, and welcome to Darwin from a slightly different perspective. What I'm going to talk about really is a little bit about the known history of Darwin, in the sense that I'm sure you're all, because you've got an interest in Darwin, are aware of his background, his family life, and some of his the quirks of his life, at least. I'm going to go over a little bit of that to provide you with some introductory information, and then digress a little bit into realms of geology, which are from a general understanding of Darwin as unexpected left turn at the traffic lights. So without more ado, let's get on with the lecture. And the first image is really the classic one of Darwin. So it's a beautiful tinted image here of the old man with all the worries of the... Sorry, Martin?
May I just interrupt for 1 second? I neglected to say for our webinar audience, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our speaker, if you look on the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function, but to the left of that is a Q&A. So if there are any questions that you'd like to ask as the talk goes through, if you can address them through there, and we'll attempt to answer them as we go along, or pass them on to David at the end. Sorry, David, thank you for that.
Yeah, I won't be able to see them until we get to the end, so we may have to wait to the end. So you'll have to put up with me whishing on. So the general image is one of a man with all the worries of the world on his shoulders, largely because of the impact of the publication of The Origin of Species, and the remarkable work that created, and the enduring power of that vision of how the Earth has evolved in an organic sense. So he basically provided answers to very puzzling questions. Why birds of paradise have this extraordinary behavior and exotic plumage. He provided a plausible biological explanation by, as a result of a series of inductive inferences that he drew from understanding the biological world, and also the way in which humans had affected the world in terms of various aspects of things like domestic breeding. So he was very broad in his interests from our perspective of the present day, because all that reasoning, that observation, and those skilled interpretations led him to a very profound interpretation of the way in which we understand life to have evolved on Earth. But that was the result of a long period of education and a long period of training, which gave him the ability to synthesize information. And from a geologist's perspective, actually, the reason that he developed those skills was because of his geological training. And that is obviously much less well appreciated, because we, with hindsight, really take things on from the time of the publication of The Origin of Species, and rather neglect the earlier phases of his life for basically perfectly understandable reasons. So a sort of potted history, just to take you back through things that I'm sure you're reasonably familiar with, would be to emphasize the fact that his roots are in Shropshire, and that he was born in Shrewsbury in this rather grand house. owned by his father, who was not only a medic, but also a bit of a financial wizard. So the, the rather grand nature of the house and the grand grounds and the very comfortable life that he lived was a consequence of the success of his father. And it has a lot to do with his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. But that's a longer and deeper story that I don't need to go into. Basically, he was indeed a rather privileged young man, brought up in very comfortable circumstances. And in truth, the family, because it was wealthy, knew, in a sense that the children knew, that their lives would be forever comfortable. And that had some repercussions in terms of the behavior and ways of Darwin's siblings. But again, that's another story because we really want to focus on Charles Darwin. But it was the case that, as I said, Robert Darwin, Charles's father, had a general practice. He was a medical doctor. And as they all did, went on their medical rounds to look after patients. And Charles would accompany him on these rounds. And it was very obvious to Robert that not only did he have a pretty bright son, he was quite quick, but he also had a very sympathetic and kindly natured son. And on that basis, he clearly recognized that this lad would make a good GP, would make a good medic, and in a sense stored that information away. As it happened, his schooling was not going particularly well. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you will know, his mother died when he was 8 years old. And the schooling that he had in that period up to about the age of 16 was not at all successful. He had far more fun with his brother Erasmus, sort of playing sort of chemical bangs and squeaks in the shed of their garden, rather than actually learning the sort of rote curriculum, which required a lot of rather pointless memory work, which was the way in which he was taught in the academy in Shrewsbury. And it was increasingly clear to his father that Charles simply wasn't applying himself to the academic curriculum in the school and really was drifting. And in an attempt to try and wrench him out of the system that he was then in, which might have ended up in him becoming a rather dissipated youth with very little in the way of ambition, but plenty of money behind him. His father sort of rather wisely decided he would send his rather young son at the age of 16 to university to learn medicine. So at this comparatively young age, he was sent to Edinburgh. A very wise choice. There were two ancient universities in England, but they were very much establishment universities, not at all thrusting and driven in academic terms. If you wanted to get a decent education, then go to Edinburgh. Edinburgh was well connected with Europe. It was much more driven by the intellectual developments in Europe, and that connection made Edinburgh a powerhouse in intellectual terms. So it was a wise choice, an obvious choice really, to send Charles there. And there was another reason. His elder brother, Erasmus, was already in Edinburgh. He, as you'll see, a bit of a coincidence, he'd already been educated in Cambridge and was extending his medical knowledge and understanding by doing courses in Edinburgh. And this coincided with when Charles would arrive. So he had an elder brother there to put a hand around his shoulder and, in a sense, teach him the ways of life, I suppose. Perhaps not the best of choices, because Erasmus turned into a rather dissipated older brother in the end. But nevertheless, it was sort of reassuring to know the elder brother was there to look after Charles. Medicine and the way it was taught in Edinburgh, as it says in the headline there, proved to be too gruesome for the rather delicate sensibilities of Charles. He had to witness operations in an operating theatre, and this was before the time of anaesthetic. And he was watching operations being carried out on young children, and the blood and the screams of pain were just too much for him. They turned his stomach. He very rapidly lost interest in medicine. As a consequence, he tended to bunk off lectures and enjoyed the other aspects of teaching that were going on in Edinburgh. So he listened to geologists like Hope and Jameson. He met the biologist Robert Grant, and was open to a number of either controversial ideas in the geological realm. Hope and Jameson argued fiercely about the structure of Arthur's Seat and the geological origins of the rocks there. And Grant was playing with ideas about the mutability of life. But again, that's another story. But he was wasting his time from a medical perspective, from his father's perspective, by not attending the medical course and actually attending other lectures on completely different subject areas. And lo and behold, his sisters blew the whistle, told father that Charles was paying very little attention to the medicine. And that led to a meeting in the second year of Edinburgh, where Charles had to explain himself to his father. The outcome of that discussion was, well, you're not going to do medicine, clearly. That's a great disappointment. I'd rather like you to have a stable career and a future. And actually the clergy, the church, would provide you with a living, a very stable, good income, and give you a standing in society. So if you attend one of the ancient universities, Oxford or Cambridge, in this instance, Cambridge, then you can do what's called an ordinary degree. Once you pass your ordinary degree, you can then take holy orders and join the church. So that was very attractive to Darwin in the sense that Gilbert White had published his Natural History of Selborne back in the 1780s, early 1790s. And that had been enormously popular. And it, basically a cleric had time to watch the natural history in the area around his church and around his living and tell a very entertaining story, which people loved. Darwin loved as well. So the idea of going to Cambridge, joining the college that Erasmus had originally been at, became quite interesting. And Darwin therefore willingly accepted the idea of coming down to Cambridge. And this is an old etching or sketch of the front of Christ. It looks just the same now, except you don't see people in mortarboards and gowns wandering up and down the street very often, beyond degree days. But the college looks basically like that. So he had an opportunity, and his father sponsored him to take an ordinary degree in Cambridge. If you read his autobiography, or the biography that was intended for his children to learn a little bit about their father's life, then you'd think he gives the impression that he had a rather dissipated and non-academic sort of career. Well, if that was the case, then how did he come 10th out of a class of 180? He's actually pretty good. He was obviously intelligent, sufficiently intelligent to pass that course with ease. The interesting thing about it is that he completed his course basically in 2 years. Smart guy, obviously took on the curriculum very quickly, even though he had to take a term out to learn Latin and Greek. In these good old days, you needed Latin and Greek before you could enter and attend the university for its lectures. So he had to take some time out to learn that before he actually entered the college. But anyway, everything came back. He passed his degree, or passed his examinations, but he couldn't graduate because he had to complete his terms of residence before he could be awarded his degree. And that's when things, in a sense, become rather interesting. So from January 1831, again, his story would be that he was footloose and fancy free, and he would go to Newmarket and enjoy the races. He would drink plenty of alcohol, have lots of fun with his friends, eating and drinking, and generally carousing. That's one perspective, not absolutely true. During those 2 terms, he spent an inordinate amount of time with a number of extremely gifted academics. Now, the mystery, as far as I'm concerned, is why? What was going on? Cambridge was an establishment place. Young gentlemen went there to be educated sufficiently in the arts and crafts of being social, in order that they could get on in the City of London and can join society in a comfortable way and can talk knowledgeably from the things they'd learned in Cambridge, but had not really trained as we would think, as aspiring academics and researchers and people that were using their intellect in a far more aggressive manner. But in the early decades of the 19th century, something was happening in Cambridge. People like John Stevens Henslow, as you see the list of people like Airy, Charles Babbage, the inventor of the difference engine, which was the forerunner of the computer, John Herschel, son of the astronomer, and astronomer general later, Miller, who's developed the Miller indices, which is very, very well known to crystallographers and mineralogists. George Peacock, whose name will recur in again in a minute. William Whewell, a very famous geologist, and also one of the greats of the Victorian era, and Adam Sedgwick, again, another geologist, another of the greats of the Victorian era. For some reason, I think the colleges of Cambridge had realized that they were wasting their time and talents and started to recruit some extremely gifted young academics. The image there of John Henslow is one of his in later life. At the time when Darwin was there in the 1820s, this was a young man, not much older than Darwin, in his late 20s, early 30s. Very dynamic, very thrusting, very gifted. Henslow in particular started off as a mineralogist, so he became professor of mineralogy, gave that up after a few years and then became professor of botany, one of these multi-talented polymaths. And in a sense, that gifted approach to science and understanding the earth and becoming what we would call a scientist, but what they would have called a natural philosopher, somebody who's trying to understand the nature and qualities of the earth and the natural world that we live and experience around us. Those sorts of people were beginning to be recruited by Cambridge so that it would, by the middle of the 19th century, become the academic powerhouse that it later became. Until then, truly, Cambridge was a waste of space. So Darwin met and was introduced to John Stevens Henslow, who was then teaching botany. He was a very charismatic teacher, very gifted, and basically Darwin was adopted by Henslow. And as it says there, undergraduates with an interest in natural philosophy, what we would now call science, were encouraged to attend soirees at Henslow's home on the edge of Parker's Peace in Cambridge. So academics or fellows, as it were, of John Henslow would assemble for tea and cakes and an evening discussing natural philosophy and mathematics. And if you were lucky and if you were interested in the natural sciences or natural philosophy, then you may be invited along. And as it happened, a second cousin, and this is a repetitive theme in Darwin's life, lucky coincidences and timings. At Christ's College, his second cousin had arrived at the college a year before, William Darwin Fox. And William Darwin Fox had already joined this group of people talking about natural philosophy and introduced Darwin to Henslow. Henslow obviously took a shine to Darwin. Darwin became his assistant in his classes and also became a favorite at home. And clearly, in a sense, Darwin was sponsored by Henslow. He gave him books to read. He enjoyed his company. He encouraged him in the sphere of natural sciences and in the sort of skills you need to develop an understanding of the natural sciences. So much so that during these 2 terms, when Darwin was supposedly kicking his heels and doing very little, he was spending an inordinate amount of time walking and talking with Henslow, being instructed in the realm of natural philosophy and being guided to read certain books. One of them, as it says there, was the narrative written by Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt, at the end of the 18th century, had undertaken an expedition to what we'd now call Brazil, northern South America. Tremendously successful expedition, went back and then described in narrative form, in book form, his adventures. It's a real sort of adventure story for boys in a way, and certainly that's the way Darwin took it. And one of the things that he was stimulated to think about in the light of Humboldt's book was, I'll run an expedition. I'll go and see these magical things and these new things that we've never seen before, and I'll bring back and describe them and understand a little bit more about the natural world. He planned an expedition with some of his undergraduate colleagues in Christ's, and the plan was go to the Canary Islands, which was Humboldt's first stop off. And what he was going to do was sort of follow Humboldt's footsteps as a mini expedition, just to get the feel of expedition work. And you've got the image there of a young Darwin actually, ideally in May, thinking about the planning for this expedition, which actually never happened, sadly. So there's Darwin, stimulated to emulate people like von Humboldt to undertake expeditions to exotic parts of the world, frustrated because his fellow students backed out at the last minute, so he couldn't get away in the summer and enjoy a raw expedition. So in a sense left to kick his heels again, and the prospect of holy orders were now presumably to some extent looming in his mind, despite all these stimulus that people like Henslow and all these other gifted academics had given him. Well, the experience that Darwin picked up as a consequence of this connection with Henslow was in a sense quite dramatic. The timing was extraordinary. In 1830, John Herschel had just published a pocket book, it was called The Discourse, but fundamentally this is a directive. This is how to do science. And it had a geological chapter as well as many other scientific discipline chapters. And it was sort of, almost holding your hand and taking you through, this is the way in which you should conduct yourself if you want to become a scientist or a natural philosopher. At roughly the same time, Charles Lyell had published the first volume of the Principles of Geology, going to be extremely influential for Darwin when he was on the voyage to the Beagle. Henslow and Sedgwick, between them, had demonstrated through practical observation of either plants or rocks that being able to observe carefully and think about what the implications of the observations you were making might have in an inductive sort of framework of understanding, provided a sort of fuel for the way in which Darwin's brain would be trained to work. One of the skills that Darwin needed to sort of pursue if he was going to undertake expeditions was to be able to map geology and understand the nature of the physical earth. And he thought it must be easy, so he went back home to Shropshire, tried to map the area around Shrewsbury, made a total pig's ear of that, came back with his tail between his legs to Henslow and said, I just can't do this. He said, right, go with Sedgwick. So Sedgwick took him on an expedition to North Wales. And in a sense, the rest is history. What Sedgwick was able to do was treat him as an energetic runner. So he would send Darwin off in directions, transect across the geological exposures. Because what he was convinced was that Greenough had made a screw up in the geological map of the British Isles that had been produced in 1822. So Sedgwick was testing out the rocks that could be observed in North Wales to see whether Greenough was right or wrong. So he sent the naive Darwin off to collect rocks, brought them back, talked through the implications of these rocks. And Darwin realized that actually, if you made the observations, you've made the collection, the observations, the interpretations, as Sedgwick had done and has been demonstrated to Darwin, you could prove somebody as eminent as the president of the Geological Society to be wrong. Being a careful observer, being able to interpret what you see could make a genuine difference. And Darwin realized he could do that, or at least he had the beginnings of the skills that would allow him to do that. And Sedgwick's field expertise allowed Darwin also to learn how to map. So all these Cambridge academics had a huge influence on the growing and evolving, dare I say, mind of Darwin at this time. The next remarkable bit of timing, because this is a repetitive theme in Darwin's life, is 1831. The first voyage of the Beagle had come back. They were planning a second voyage, and George Peacock, who was at Trinity at Cambridge, was designated with the task of finding a companion for Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy had taken over the first voyage of the Beagle after the suicide of the captain. The loneliness experienced by the captain during that first voyage led to his suicide. Fitzroy realized that he couldn't go on an expedition without having somebody of similar social status or standing to, in a sense, be a companion and get him through the voyage by having a genuine sort of long-term friend, I suppose, to help with the demands of a very challenging expedition. So the recommendations came in. Obviously, Henslow was first choice. He's just a natural philosopher, and the right age and the right intellectual background and the right social standing. Second choice was a biologist, zoologist called Leonard Jennings, who lived in Bottisham, just north of Cambridge, but had been trained in Cambridge. Both of them had all the skills. Third choice ended up being Darwin. Henslow refused because he was young, he had a young family, his wife really didn't want him to go. And if you think about it, a voyage around the world in a little wooden boat back in the 1830s must have been a bit like sort of committing your husband to a trip to Mars. And what are the chances of coming back? Not as great as you'd like, perhaps. Leonard Jennings in exactly the same position. He was a curate with a young family. And again, his wife was very reluctant, so he refused. And Charles Darwin was therefore suggested as of the right social standing, beginning to develop the skills that Henslow admired in terms of his understanding of the natural world. And the question then was his approval by Robert Fitzroy. And eventually, despite the shape of his nose, apparently, Fitzroy chose to accept the young Charles Darwin as his companion and natural philosopher. His philosopher in the sense that what you had was the empire was sending out expeditions like this to map not only the coastal arrangements of the world for navigational purposes, but also more subtly to look for natural resources that could be exploited by the empire. So one of the purposes for the natural philosopher was to actually see what was there in terms of gems, minerals, coals, things that could be exploited by the empire. So the addition of the natural philosopher was actually quite an important component of this essentially navigational circumnavigation of the world, and the mapping of the coastal areas for navigational purposes for shipping. So off we go. So in late December, almost January 1831, the very excited Darwin is presented by Charles Lyell's first volume, The Principles of Geology, by a very wise Captain Fitzroy. It was a very fortunate timing because there was a huge debate after the publication of that volume, certainly within the realm of the British geological community, who, in a sense, either profoundly disagreed or despised Lyell's interpretations. Darwin picked this up naive to all these discussions, all the argument, and in fact followed the principles by looking at the geology that he experienced during the voyage of the Beagle, and was profoundly influenced by the correctness of Lyell's principles. And the two other volumes were eventually delivered to him while he was on the voyage. So remarkable timing. So there's the voyage, extraordinary. You leave Plymouth, you go down the coast, you try and go to the Canary Islands, but I think it was cholera had been the warning that meant they couldn't disembark on the Canary Islands, but went straight to the Cape Verde Islands, then down to Brazil, down the coast of South America, up the other side of South America, across the Pacific, Australia, Indian Ocean, South Africa, back to Brazil and back to Plymouth. Absolutely extraordinary. It's a testament to the skill of Robert Fitzroy that they made it in the relatively small bark that they travelled in, and no doubt a certain element of luck as well. They survived, and Darwin benefited from this extraordinary experience when he was young and extremely fit. Again, one of the aspects that we sort of take for granted about Darwin is that he's perpetually ill. That was not the case when the young Darwin was on this voyage. He was supremely fit. His endurance, despite the fact that he was enduringly seasick, was quite extraordinary throughout the trip. So a remarkable experience. I've had the privilege of going to the Galapagos Islands, and this is a beautiful painting by John Chancellor of James Island, or Isla Santiago, which is more or less in the center of the Galapagos, the Bainbridge Islands, Bainbridge Rocks on either side. Santiago is the only island that Darwin spent any time on. And I've actually followed in his footsteps, proving that some of the collections that he made were genuinely made from that island, whereas people had doubted that before, and they even doubted that the curator of the Sedgwick Museum had got the numbers right and the rocks identified right. But we were right, and the naysayers were wrong. So that it was nice to be able to do that. But that is a most beautiful illustration of the bark, the Beagle. John Chancellor was absolutely fastidious about the accuracy of that. It's a most wonderful image. His son was at Oxford when I was at Oxford teaching, and I've seen this portrait close up. It's the most beautiful thing. Anyway, just a little bit of an aside, but there was Darwin on that boat on the Galapagos in 1834. So what sort of scientist did Darwin think he was? With hindsight, we think he must have been a biological natural historian. He didn't think that at all. He thought he was a geologist. And he did so until at least 1846. And in fact, he always talked geology, his first love. He did so with Charles Lyell. They became great friends because he was so influenced by the principles. And Charles Lyell would come regularly down to Down House to talk over tea with Charles about new developments in geology. And Darwin never gave up that interest. And indeed, he never let his rock collection leave his home. All his other collections made on the voyage of the Beagle were distributed around various museums around the country, but he never gave up his first love. After he died, they eventually all came to the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge and were passed on by his son Francis in the 1890s. And they're the final proof. This is the amount of effort Darwin was putting into his observations. Nearly 1,400 pages of geological notes, only about 370 pages of zoological notes. You can tell where he was putting his effort in during the voyage of the Beagle. He was trained to make observations. He was trained by Sedgwick in geological observation interpretation. And he really sort of put that into action in terms of the amount of time he spent making the notes from the observations and the rocks that he'd collected. And doing this while he was back on board the Beagle, trying to make sense of the stuff that he'd seen. I think that's quite telling in terms of the amount of effort he was putting into the geological side of things, which is why I'm talking to a geological society tonight. So Darwin's work after the voyage can sort of be summarized in a number of ways, but put very briefly, he published an enormously popular equivalent to von Humboldt's narrative. The Voyage of the Beagle was a bestseller. It was really, really popular, and the general population loved it. He then published, during that period up to 1846, a series of scientific papers on the geology of South America, and in particular on the formation of coral islands. And within that was an enormous amount of fundamentally important geology. And as a little aside, a little anecdote, in 1907, Archibald Geikie, who was then, or Geekie, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, who was then president of the Royal Society and president of the Geological Society, thought, it's the centenary of the Geological Society. I'll write a book that at least summarizes the most important contributions in the Geological Journal over the last century. Wouldn't that be good? And you could almost see his eyebrows rising as he started to appreciate that Darwin had published some of the most important geological papers that century. It surprised him. And it, in a sense, reflects the fact that his work had been obscured by the publication of this damn book, The Origin of Species. In the 1850s, he started working on barnacle monographs, which he published, a series of monographs on living and fossil organisms. So he's exploring the history of the Earth as well as how you do taxonomy on living species. Curiously, the barnacles, but that was one of his quirky approaches to life. And in a sense, Darwin was then transitioning from the fossil record, the geology, towards paleontology, and then the species question, by examining taxonomic issues on living animals, as well as how you recognize species in the fossil record. 1859, of course, he published The Origin of Species and basically obliterated his legacy in geology. And then from 1860 onwards, he published a series of books which are fundamentally chapters from The Origin of Species, each of which in their own right are brilliant expositions that reinforce the ideas that he was trying to produce about gradual change and transmutation or evolution as we now know it. So I'm now going to sort of summarize the sort of the geological part of his work in a not very chronological way. I'm just going to pick out some items because it would take me an awful long time. It would take quite a lot of time already. So the barnacle work that he did included things like goose barnacles, which you can see on the left there with this curious fleshy neck, and the normal, more clamped type of barnacle that you see on the bottom of boats. And not only did he revealed the detailed anatomy and biology of these animals, which had hitherto not been properly appreciated, but also how you recognize individual species and how they vary across the world, and how you can apply that understanding to the fragmentary specimens that you find in the fossil record. He was probing how fixed species are and how we recognize them, and whether there are any limits or boundaries to biological species that are revealed by their anatomy. So that was, in a sense, him exploring the natural world and what is left in the natural world, or what lives in the natural world, in relation to the boundaries between and within species. He also looked at the unnatural variability that could be introduced by domestic breeding. And he spent an awful lot of time with pigeon fanciers and other domestic breeders in order to understand that a single species had some degree of plasticity. If breeders could create pouters and rollers and various other forms of pigeon from the native pigeon, then where are the boundaries between species, and how flexible, how mutable might species be under certain circumstances? He was exploring boundaries, and he was exploring the mutability within species in a very profound way. He was doing the experiments by using other people, their observations, and how they in a sense, how they behaved and how they used their eyes to create these particular reproductive weirdos. On the Galapagos Islands, he had the opportunity to look at a rather interesting experiment in species variability and species diversity because of the well-known Darwin finches and their beak-shaped variability. This is just a lovely old diagram illustrating the various forms of the beaks in different sorts of Galapagos finch. Unfortunately, he indiscriminately collected, so he didn't make a very good record of finches on the Galapagos Islands. It was actually the shape of the tortoise shells that allowed him to appreciate that each island had its own distinctive tortoise population, whereas he might have been able to distinguish between the populations of finches on different islands if he'd only collected. But that's just history. But again, with the hindsight, after he'd slapped his forehead a few times, it was demonstrated to him by other ornithologists that actually species variability between and within islands was actually a very interesting topic, which fitted into his ideas about the mutability of species and the origin of species. All this formed an inductive framework for the assembly of all the data that was going to lead to the publication of The Origin of Species, and that wonderful diagram there, which is sort of indicating his idea about the tree of life, his sort of thoughts that maybe there is a common ancestor, maybe things have descended with modification through enormous amounts of time, which powered The Origin of Species. But let's not dwell too much on Darwin and evolution. Darwin's greatest contribution with hindsight are actually how rocks are formed and how they, dare I say, evolve, how they actually change in characteristics across the history of life, well, the petrological world on Earth, how Earth works in a dynamic sense, something you couldn't appreciate on the British Isles because it's so stable, but his experiences in South America elsewhere were absolutely profound in making you appreciate how dynamic the Earth was. And that wonderful work they did on coral islands and how they, in a sense, change or evolve over time. Then, of course, there's The Origin of Species, evolution, founding ethology, behavioral studies, ecological studies, and then, putting man in its place. Man wasn't, in a sense, preordained, God-given as the pinnacle of God's creation, but just a part of the natural process of evolution that he had produced and hypothesized about. That obviously, in the end, was his biggest problem. That's why he looked so worried, because his wife was very religious, and there was that tension in the family between what he was saying and her deep belief in the established rule of things and the literal interpretation of the Bible. Anyway, let's go back to the red bit, the rocks. His perspective on the voyage of the Beagle and the way his brain worked, I think, is quite remarkable. And it's born of the way he was told that you need to make observations and then induce understanding or interpretations from those observations. First stop on the Cape Verde Islands. He could see the Canary Islands, but he couldn't actually offload, in a sense, disembark until he got to the Cape Verde Islands. And this nice illustration here shows the volcanic eminence in the background. But more importantly, you can see that line interrupting the cliffs, which was, as he then found out, a raised beach. Something had happened. Something had lifted the original beach up. And he suspected that it was the volcanic activity that had raised the island and therefore left that beach behind, which is preserved as a fossil. There's obviously another beach right at the top as well. But that was fitted into the dynamic interpretation that Lyell had started to introduce in his Principles of Geology. And it's sort of locked in his mind. Raised beaches, interesting. There's some sort of dynamic relationship here between the ocean and the land. And how am I ever going to see this again? Well, yes, you do. As soon as he got to the coast of Brazil, he saw exactly the same phenomenon. He saw these raised beaches, and in a sense, thinking along the same way, said not only, yeah, they're raised beaches. I wonder if it's some uplift that's occurred, or is it movement of the sea? Well, I can't really tell. Maybe it could be either. So let's just think about and examine this. And what came out of this was he decided to measure the elevation of the raised beaches at intervals down the coast of Brazil into Argentina and then the coast of Chile. Now, would I think to have done that? Yeah, would I help? It was an extraordinary collection of data. And you can see that's from his notebook at the bottom there. What it revealed ultimately was that the raised beaches weren't evenly lifted. They had different heights as you moved down the coast. Interesting. What that eventually suggested to him when he got back and thought about the data was that the entire continent had been tilted. He also suspected strongly that it had been lifted. So there'd been a process of lifting and moving of an entire continent. How had that happened? His mind is now sort of really powered up by these basic and rather simple observations and the implications of what that might have meant. So his interpretation in the end was that you have a succession of terraces, which is provided for in this simplified diagram here, which are a consequence of the elevation of the land. So you're leaving these beaches behind as the land is jacked up, and that this occurs at intervals. You get pulses of elevation and then stability, and then another pulse of elevation and stability, and so on. So it's a slow, progressive, interval-driven process. So it's slow, it's progressive. By small changes, things are gradually beginning to occur, which may be more dramatic in the long term if you give time long enough to work. The next major experience he had began to tie all these observations together, because they went around the coast, came up the Chilean side and came into Concepcion just as there had been a major earthquake, the first one he'd really experienced. And this allowed him to make some rather interesting but dispassionate observations. So he arrived in Concepcion, the place was devastated. And the natural philosopher, or the scientific mind, observed the devastation, despite all the human sort of devastation and distress. He was able to observe that there were lines where buildings were still intact and lines where they'd been completely destroyed. And he imposed on that the idea that the earthquake had a wave function, and that therefore the rippling effect of the earthquake had caused this very characteristic pattern of damage. So that he almost felt guilty about making these sort of dispassionate physical observations at the time. At the same time, he was able to notice that the seafloor in the area around Concepcion had been raised up. So at the same time as the earthquake, there had been a raising of the seafloor because there were stranded fish and dead seaweed, and the relics of the original seafloor had been lifted. So the earthquake had clearly been associated with an uplift of the land. It was one of these periodic elevations that he'd mapped out when he was looking at the raised beaches around the coast of South America. He was also told, although he didn't see it, that there'd also at the same time been volcanic eruptions further up the Andes. And in his mind, he linked all these three things together. The volcanic activity was linked to the earthquake, which was linked to the elevation of the land. And he began to unify these observations into a sort of dynamic interpretation of the Earth and how it's driven. As he very eloquently writes here, it's hardly possible to doubt that this great elevation of the Andean mountain chain has been affected by successive small upliftings. So these little processes, this is redolent of the way he thinks about evolution by little changes, but such as that accompanied or caused the earthquake of this year. Thousands of miles of both coasts of South America have been upraised within the recent period by a slow, continued, intermittent movement. He's beginning to unify the observations into a dynamic theory that ties these immediate phenomena together as part of a single dynamic process, which he would eventually write up in the Geological Society's journal. And again, in his flowery language, the grandeur occurs in the origin of species, but the grandeur of one motive power for mountain chains, volcanoes, earthquakes, and continental elevation, tying them all together, completely unknown, but it's slow, intermittent, but irresistible. He was grasping at this. He was really trying to sort of tie this together. He knew that they were all true. He knew that it all fitted together in an inductive sense, but what he couldn't figure out was where the power was coming from. When he looked at the tilting of the continent, he could work out that the continent had been lifted and tilted by a power that was just off the coast of Chile. He could almost get in his boat and say, it's there. I don't know what it is, but it's there. That's moving an entire continent, which is a staggering thought. And as I say at the moment, he could understand the elevation or depression of the land as an ongoing dynamic process because it was visible. What he couldn't have interpreted was plate tectonics. He wouldn't have understood that things could translate laterally rather than moving vertically alone. And it wasn't until the 1960s that explanation eventually came to light. Almost exactly a century later. And as I think his reaction would have been rather like that of Huxley when he read The Origin of Species, in the sense of, yes, of course, I see now, how silly of me not to have thought of that. I could almost imagine Darwin saying that. But he was so close to, he developed this dynamic theory, and it's tantalizing. I wish he could have been told that tectonics would eventually be the interpretation that he needed to demonstrate where the power was coming from, because the oceanic trench just off the coast of Chile is what is elevating the mountains and creating volcanic activity, and explaining all the phenomena that he was observing when he was simply taking those data points of elevation of the race beaches when he was progressing down the coast of Brazil into Argentina on the eastern side of South America. Absolutely extraordinary. Another fundamentally and really important aspect of the work that he published in that period up to 1846 was the, as I say, evolution of the oceanic islands. This partly grew from his observations on the Cape Verde Islands, the vertical motion, the volcanic eminence, and the relationship between the ocean and the eruption of a volcano, which created an island. So his familiarity of the Atlantic led to an interpretation in the Pacific. And what he was able to demonstrate rather beautifully, again in his published work, was that in that top diagram, you have the volcanic eminence, which is emerged from the sea. And he tied this beautifully to an observation that coral organisms will only grow within a certain depth, as long as there's sunlight, so that these things can use their photosynthetic bacteria to power their activities and deposit carbonate. As long as the island is emerged, then the coral organisms can attach themselves to the shoreline, and begin to grow and create a coral. But as that volcanic eminence, under its own weight, gradually subsides and flexes the ocean floor, the coral organisms have to grow up on either side to maintain their photosynthetic activity and grow the coral. So The island in the middle slowly disappears as it sinks. On either side there's a coral lagoon, and that's fringed by the coral reef itself. Eventually, the bottom diagram, the volcano has sunk completely below the ocean waves, and all you're left with is a ring of coral, reflecting the original boundary of the volcanic eminence that had been the island. And this interpretation ran against the Coral Island interpretation of Charles Lyell. But when Darwin explained it to him, he said, absolutely, you've got it in one. And we can now use aerial photography to demonstrate. There's a lovely volcanic island with the reef lagoon and the reef fringing reef that you can see, in a sense, diagram A in Darwin's sequence. And there's a lovely aerial photograph of the entire process. Bottom right, you've got an island with the fringing lagoon and the fringing reef. In the center, you've got the enlargement of the lagoon as the island sinks, or the volcano sinks. And top left corner, you've got the completely submerged volcano, and all that's left is the fringing reef, forming what we now call an atoll. Beautiful. He didn't have the advantage of aerial photographs, which demonstrate it so clearly, but his interpretation is absolutely correct. So his influence on geology, just from those two major pieces of work, was profound in terms of the dynamism, the nature of how the Earth works as a machine. At a more subtle level, he also looked at rocks and the way they change over time. Rocks, when they first appear as magma, for example, undergo weathering. The weathering changes the composition of the magma and creates a degree of rock diversity, or petrological diversity. If you consider fractional crystallization within the magma, then individual crystals will crystallize out at different temperatures within the liquid magma. They will also segregate according to their relative density, which creates different populations within what was originally a unified magmatic body. And he recognized this because he could see magma pools on the Galapagos Islands, and he could see the segregation of crystals within the magma pool that he'd found on James Island. So he didn't just look and collect, he observed what was there, and then started to formulate explanations of what might be going on as this magmatic pool cooled, or at least this lava pool cooled. The linking of volcanoes, earthquakes, and elevation, we've gone through, volcanic activity, moving entire continents, again, all demonstrated by Darwin. Just to emphasize with this awful diagram, what I'm trying to say is that the magma, the lava, the liquid rock that's coming up from deeper at the upper mantle, below the crust, will undergo a series of changes depending on differential crystallization at different temperatures, and there will be segregation according to relative density of the different mineral parts of the lava. This allowed him to speculate on the idea that actually what you've got here is the differentiation and creation, dare I say it, of different species of rock by their subtraction from the original parent lava, and that leads to diversity. Isn't that redolent of something that reflects the way his mind worked when he was talking about his theory of evolution? Because in the end, what he provided was mechanisms that actually are almost similar, but they reflect a similar way of thinking. They are mechanisms in this instance of how to generate diversity in the petrological as well as the biological world. In the petrological world, he recognized that differential subtraction of minerals from the magma causes it to evolve, that is, change over time and create new species or different varieties. It creates petrological diversity. Other processes like weathering also add to that diversity. He was playing with how does the Earth create the diverse populations within the petrological kingdom, and was probing this from the observations that he'd made on the voyage of the Beagle, and then giving himself time to think about the implications of what he was observing and thinking about. That's a remarkable way of thinking. Equally, in the biological world, the phraseology is, I'm cheating a little bit, it's not quite the same, but it's again, the differential subtraction of the less fit individuals in population, the survival of the fittest, causes organisms to evolve, generate biological diversity. You can see, I think, with a slightly warped pair of lenses on your glasses, that it's a way of thinking. It's a way of approaching and understanding, in this instance, not only the physical, but the Earth from a physical sense, but also the Earth from a biological sense. And that these changes, these mechanisms lead in the end to a process of diversity. Added to this, you have Darwin's perspective on the very stable Britain and Europe, relatively geologically speaking. You have the perspective that was added by his visits, particularly to South America, where the bulk of the voyage was spent, actually, on the dynamic nature of the Earth, how genuinely dynamic it is over time, and how little changes accumulate over time and produce great big changes. You can form a mountain if you slowly elevate or jack up through earthquake activity and elevation and the activity of volcanoes. He understood that small changes can lead to big changes if you have long enough. And that's a sort of fundamental principle that underlies his idea about how the diverse range of species have appeared on Earth. It's small changes accumulating over a long period of time, creating a huge diversity of different forms, even if it's not massive mountains. So there's our man. He started off as a ambitious, I think, highly intelligent young student. The intriguing thing about Darwin and his relationship with these rather gifted academics that were in Cambridge is that, dare I say, I know as an academic, as I'm teaching undergraduate students, you recognize those that have a spark of real intellectual ability. And actually, you are prepared to spend more time with them and encourage their intellect, because you know they're going somewhere. I bet you Henslow, as an excellent teacher, saw just that in Darwin. Darwin claims not to have recognized it in himself, and he was naturally sort of modest about his abilities. But I think the reason that people like Henslow spent time talking to Darwin was that they recognized a kindred spirit. They recognized an intellect that could be grown and could be encouraged and nourished. They taught him a variety of ways of looking at the world. They taught him skills as a mineralogist, a petrologist, an anatomist, an ecologist, behaviorist, and so on. It's extraordinary. And from that young man, a little bit like the young man who was just about to get married to Emma Wedgwood, which is the chalk drawing on the left, to the old man, he developed into this extraordinary synthetic evolutionist, where he was able to draw in so many different factors. Even though he couldn't prove, in a sense, evolution, all his logic, his barrister's logic of assembling all the data and making a persuasive case, accumulated through his books, which followed up from The Origin of Species, to, in a sense, make an overwhelming case for his theory of evolution. So I hope that to some extent has opened your eyes maybe a little bit to the fact that Darwin was a genuine geologist. He made profound contributions to the field of geology. If he hadn't written that book, The Origin of Species, I think we would still revere the contributions that Darwin made, which were to some extent overprinted by the huge impact that The Origin of Species had. And there's an element of regret. In a way, it's a shame that his geological work wasn't as appreciated, or hasn't been as appreciated as it was in the period leading up to the mid-1850s, before he published The Origin of Species, and then it's in a sense smeared over by the publication of The Origin of Species. So there's the young Charles Darwin. That's an attempt to reconstruct Darwin as a student. Actually, one of my students, one of my zoologists, did a bit of sculpting in his spare time and created the clay model, from which we created a bronze to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. It's now in the garden in Christ's College. And it's a lovely piece of work, and I'm delighted to be able to tell you that all the Darwin family, many of which live still in the Cambridge area, pretty much approved the look of the man. We didn't know what Darwin looked like as a young man, but we had the geography of his face, his eyes, his nose, and his mouth from photographs in later life. So we removed his beard, gave him some hair, and created this rather splendid image, which I'm actually very proud of. And I'm really proud of Anthony Smith, who made the clay model from which the bronze was cast. As a result of the celebrations to do with that and its 200th anniversary, which we celebrated very well in Cambridge, with big international conferences and so on, I established a trust fund. So we now sponsor researchers both on the Galapagos and in Cambridge to interconnect, so that we can train Galapagos researchers in scientific techniques in Cambridge, and scientific researchers in Cambridge can go over to the Galapagos. But it is a genuinely collaborative effort, and of that I'm particularly proud. So there you are. I will attempt to stop the share now. I hope I haven't sent too many of you to sleep, but there you go.
Hello again, David. Not at all. I was actually sat on the edge of my seat, I think, most of the way through that. Very interesting. We've got one early question coming from Ray Pratt, and he asks, how did Darwin earn his income after the Beagle voyage? Was he simply a gentleman of leisure, or did he hold a position?
He was a gentleman of leisure. He inherited money from his father. He also, he was actually very wise. He invested in the railways. So he took out shares in the burgeoning railway system. And in addition to the income that he got from his books, he lived a very comfortable life. So he wasn't a great financier as his father had been, but he lived a very comfortable life. And he didn't need to work. He could spend all his time, in a sense, coping with his illnesses. I'm rather taken with the idea that he was probably lactose intolerant, and many of the symptoms that he displayed, and he kept fastidious notes on his symptoms throughout the rest of his life, can be explained in terms of him being lactose intolerant. And there is lactose intolerance in the Darwin family. So I think, sadly, his wife, after he came back from water cures, which would have made him a lot better because they removed milk from his diet, his wife would then build him up by giving lots of milk puddings and things like that, which brought the symptoms back, I fear. There's some nice work done on that by a medic in London who told me about this, because his daughter was suffering from lactose intolerance, and he suddenly recognized that the symptoms were all like those of Darwin's. Sorry, that's totally irrelevant. But no, he was financially quite comfortable throughout his life. He never needed to work and could be a retired gentleman who simply published books.
Great. I can't remember whether if I've remembered this correctly, but I think in his early life, Darwin, as you say, was incredibly fit. Didn't he follow a beagle pack at Cambridge, which would involve an awful lot of exercise?
Oh yeah. Being an undergraduate in Cambridge at Christ's, Christ's was deliberately chosen simply because it was more of a relaxed college. There were some other colleges like Trinity and St. John's, which were more fiercely academic at that time. And his father sent him to a college where it was a slightly more relaxed atmosphere. So Darwin, undoubtedly, it was a very social animal. He had an enormous group of friends. He used to love wine and drinks and meals and socializing generally. He went to Newmarket Racecourse. He, I don't know whether he had the college may have had a pack of hounds. I'm not sure about that.
I think he might.
He used to go all over the country, all the countryside, collecting beetles for his own personal interests and collections. And I think his first mention in the published literature was some beetles he's collected, which were published in a field guide to insects.
We've got another question come in from Paul Harding. I'm just going to end the recording now whilst we're doing questions and answers. I think that's if I can.